Alrighty. Good. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming and joining us. We're really happy to have you. For those of you who are curious about what we're talking about, just to make sure you're in the right room, we're talking about cloud and how to work successfully in cloud. There are other sessions going on, so I just want to make sure that you guys are in the right one. So the format, we're going to have a panel discussion. I have some questions. We'll get some answers. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And I think for us, and I think we're all in agreement that that's the part we enjoy the most, is having questions. So we'll have questions from Slido, and the questions from in the room. We actually have quite a few people in the room here, which is wonderful. We're really excited. And there are a lot of people joining us as well through the WebEx. So we'll get started. So more individuals and organizations are talking about moving to the cloud or starting to work in the cloud. But what does that really mean? What does that look like? We really want to have an understanding of, as we start moving into this, into the cloud space, and as we move sort of more towards digital government, we want to make sure that we have an understanding of what that could look like and what are the concerns that we may have and how can we alleviate some of those concerns. So our experts are going to explain to us what working in the cloud means, the benefits, and also the risks that are involved, and how we can effectively mitigate those risks and the challenges. So my name is Teresa D'Andrea. I work with the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, and I'm responsible for interoperability for the Government of Canada. My two current projects I'm working on are the Canadian Digital Exchange Platform, which is an interoperability platform for the government, and also a Tell Us Once program, which is starting to look at how do we interact with citizens and how do we get them to tell us their information once and then we can reuse it behind the scenes many times. So my role really involves innovation, experimentation, and working a lot with users in mind. So everything that we do, we always put the users at the center, whether it's computer science, someone in computer science who's looking to onboard onto our interoperability platform, or working with citizens to actually get them to, to understand how they operate and what works for them when they start, logging into sort of a My Account and their whatever happens afterwards, and looking at their program information. So, we have, if you're wondering what an interop person is doing here talking about cloud. For us, all of our products, whether it's the API store or whether it's some sort of a Tell Us Once portal, everything we do is in the cloud. And so we have wonderful guests who are here on our panel. They're experts in the field of cloud. We have Lisa, Scott, and Carolyn who are going to be joining us. They're going to introduce themselves and tell us maybe a little bit about what it is to be innovative in your field.
Oh, thank you.
We'll start with you, Lisa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Lifshitz. I'm a partner at Tork & Mains, a law firm in Toronto, and chair of their technology, data management, and privacy group. So I'm a tech lawyer, and I'm passionate about all things technology and privacy, particularly the cloud. I was one of the first people probably in Canada as a lawyer who was interested in this area. I think the cloud is incredibly interesting and innovative, and it's a very dynamic area of technology that's constantly innovating, which is why when I produced a book this year, I called it Cloud 3.0, not Cloud 1.0, because it's a constantly evolving technology, and the contracts associated with it and the legal and ethical issues associated with it are also constantly evolving.
Excellent. Scott?
My name is Scott Lebac. I'm the Director of Cloud Oversight and Core Technologies within the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board. My team is responsible for setting policy and strategic direction for technologies in just about every area except security. For that, we work with our cybersecurity colleagues. We're also responsible for oversight of technology investments. My role really in my history around cloud is probably since 2014, working to set the strategic direction as well as the policy direction for cloud adoption in the Government of Canada. In 2018, we published our Cloud First policy direction. So we challenge departments to use cloud as their primary deployment model for IT. And a lot of the work we've been doing is really about, if you think about traditionally in the government of Canada, when we deliver IT, we buy all the base components. We buy software, we buy hardware, we buy facilities, and we engineer those into solutions. And with cloud, we're really buying a service. It's much more like a hydro utility or water, where we're consumers of a service to deliver IT. So it's caused us to have to reinterpret and take certain risk decisions, not necessarily change our policy, but reinterpret it for that shift in the way that we're delivering IT when it comes to cloud.
So I'm Carolyn Waters. I'm with the National Research Council on a 2-year secondment from Dalhousie University, where amongst other things, I remain a professor of computer science. So I have a lab on human-computer interaction and on textual analytics in the large scale. So I'll focus on NRC. So we, of course, have scientists doing big-scale science projects at NRC. And so the tipping point between having to have all the blinking lights down in the next building so you can go and check that they're all working, and actually putting it on the cloud and developing some level of trust and some experience with that. We're in the midst of that right now. I have had a very good experience in Nova Scotia when I was provost at Dalhousie, in taking all of the student information, which is very sensitive information, and allowing that to go up on a cloud. It had to be in Canada. The Nova Scotia regulations on personal data are quite strict. So we kept it in Canada. I don't think anybody could tell the difference, actually, after the dust settled. But so I think that there's opportunities. You have to pick your spot. And I think that's where we're going to get to here, some thinking about picking that spot.
Excellent. So thank you guys very much for being here. So we'll start off from a definitions perspective. What exactly is cloud? What does it mean to work in the cloud? And can you give me some examples of how you're doing this and how you are working in the cloud? Maybe we can start with Lisa.
I thought that was your definition.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You want me to go? Okay, sure.
Scott.
I think I talked a little bit about moving from a model where we own all our technology assets to becoming consumers. So it's really about making that shift. And part of that is just getting over the mental shift. You talked about blinky lights in the next building, and the cooling comfort that we get from saying I can see the thing, and because I can see the thing, I'm sure it's secure. So it's moving to a model now where you're dealing with a private sector provider who is holding some of your most sacred treasures and the things that citizens have trust us with, right? And so not only do we have to be comfortable with that shift of now using private providers to host the data, but we also have to be very transparent and be very clear with our citizens as to, what are the rules around that? What does that mean? And we have to be aware of their concerns as well. So that, is a big factor when we make decisions about what we move to the cloud, how we work in the cloud, is keeping in mind that we're constantly under the scrutiny of citizens, and while they become more tech savvy, there's still a lot of mythology about there, right? Like we hear about big bad tech, and so we have to be mindful of that when we do work in the cloud, that we're all going through a transition period. We're all getting through that period of saying, we're going from owning technology to consuming technology. It's almost like going from, gas cars to electric cars, right? You're going to have early adopters, and people are going to say, I'm ready to go. And you're still going to have a lot of fence sitters. And it's going to take a while for that transition to happen. And I think that's true with cloud as well.
So when we say cloud, I mean, you have visual images of fluffy white, blue things, right, in the sky. But what you're really talking about is a series of network computers sitting in data centers all over the world, right? So that's really the difference. It's the difference between having it on premises, where you can go look at the hardware, talk to the IT people, and say that's where the data is literally sitting in those servers in that premises, versus it being, as Scott said, it being outsourced, so to speak, to third parties who are managing for you across the globe.
So if I could just add a note here, I think that we have to be careful that we don't lump all cloud into one model. So there are models where it's public. You go to Amazon or Google or wherever, and you buy the cycles, and you buy the applications, and you buy your share of the hardware on a rent for service. But there are clouds, so a government, for example, could have its own cloud, actually, that's managing this across the country or internationally.
And that's known as a private cloud.
It's a private cloud, and there are many, many instances of hybrid clouds. So where you have highly secure things, you want to make sure it's right there, or at least accessible in a very secure way. So it's a risk mitigation. Sometimes it's a matter of latency. So if you think of the far north, you may, for some particular applications, want to have a hybrid. So you've got access to a public one, and you've got some private pieces. But in terms of the question, if I come back to the question, if you're working, I don't know that anybody here old enough to remember time-sharing machines in the 80s. It's just like that. You get on, you get the software's working, you don't really know where it is, somebody else is looking after it. And then we all went to PCs, and then we could afford to have high-performance computing in our building. And so we went a different way. And now we're actually saying, well, that sharing mode actually works best in many, many cases. And so from a user, it should be an indifferent experience, whether it's in the building or outside the building. So I think that part of that is part of this reaction. Oh, well, how do I know it'll work if it's somewhere else? I think you know if it works. If it's not working and you can actually find a person to help you, then you've got a good system. Doesn't matter whether the hardware is there. It matters whether the expertise is available.
It's also worth mentioning that probably most of you are using it already in your
Exactly.
personal life.
Do you have Gmail? Do you put your photos up on some place to store them?
Do you back up to iCloud?
Yeah.
You're using the cloud.
Yeah. And I think going back, I mean, I remember putting in a request for a server because I needed to, stand up some application. And I remember, the guy walking by with the trolley, and, with a big, nice big Sun micro, and he's like, yeah, I'm just going to rack it, and you can use it and give me half an hour or whatever. And going from that where you had a box or you share a box, you'd partition it, and this was your section, to going and literally having a dashboard where you say, I'm going to provision, and you stand up, and I need this much, and I need this much space. And that scalability, and I need an extra, and I need an extra, and I need this, but I only need it for this amount of time. The scalability and that elasticity is really what makes cloud so powerful, right? And for us to be able to play with that. So we're living in a very digital and connected world, and as we're sort of moving more into sharing and being much more collaborative, it's inevitable that we're all going to move our systems to the cloud. So will it become a natural way for us to work and share information in the future? What are some benefits, and what are some risks or challenges that you foresee of working in this way?
I'll start with the natural bit. I think that we would be a bit naive if we think that the cloud is the last word in computing, right? So we know that every 18 months, the whole computing world turns upside down, and we have to catch up. When I teach a first-year class, I tell them in the very first lesson, half of the jobs that you might apply for when you graduate don't have a name yet. And half of the things we're going to teach you in this very expensive four-year program will be out of date. So this is a very, very volatile world, and we need to keep that in mind as we do this. It is certainly the current model. I can't see it moving anywhere for 4 or 5 years.
No, I think that's a good point. At one time, 40, 50 years ago, we were in love with mainframes, right? They did everything. They were fantastic, and they've served us for 40 or 50 years, and will probably continue to in our critical systems. But at one point, we started to curse them as not being the most efficient technology. And we can't kid ourselves that, while cloud is here today, I think is going to help us refocus our energy on probably delivering, those digital services and not so much at the bottom end of the technology stack. I have no doubt in 30 or 40 years, we're going to be sitting there cursing, AWS and Google and all those people as well as being, old technologies because of quantum or whatever the next thing is. But I think what we have to understand is we get a lot of value out of those technologies for the period that we use them. And I think what's important for our workforce, and I think skills are key when we talk about cloud, is our ability to pivot, right? And that's really talking about the people, is to understand that technology will continue to shift. The cloud we see today is not the cloud we'll see tomorrow, and it certainly wasn't the one we saw 10 years ago. And so our workforce is so key in making sure that we can take advantage of those technologies. And as they transition, while it may be expensive to transition, that one, we'll get the value out of them, and two, that when it's time to change, we'll have the workforce, the skills, and the energy to make that change to the next technology.
And I'm just going to chime in with something paradoxical, just because I like to do that. On the one hand, I wouldn't say that every piece of data is something that should be put in the cloud, because if I have the secret sauce formula to something, I'm not going to put it in the cloud. I'm going to lock it in a drawer, right? Because that, if I'm basing my business on that, I am not entrusting that to anybody or any third party. At the same time, though, and for the record, I act for both vendors and users, so I'm not, touting any one, client or vendor here at all. Most, and I'm going to touch on this later, most cloud vendors who are serious about this business have much better security practices than most, private sector enterprises, right? Because this is what they do, and this is what they're spending their time and money on, right? So all the people who are absolutely terrified of putting any data in the cloud, I really question, when you think about all the horror stories that come out about legacy systems and legacy software and unpatched this and virus that, cloud providers, generally speaking, want to stay in business, and it behooves them to actually have adequate security most of the time.
So I think there's two things I'd like to touch on. There is, in terms of data, the government of Canada today is not comfortable with putting data that's of national interest in public cloud. At one point, I think we had a hard time with even protected data, but we've gotten to the point where we've established trust, we've established compliance, and we've put them through a rigorous process. Could we be putting national security information in the public cloud in the future? Maybe, but I think for now, we're saying that's off the table. I think when it comes to security, I think you're absolutely right. The cloud providers, because of their scale, because they want to maintain trust. If they have a breach, their loss of trust in their clients would be detrimental to them. But I think what's important to understand is security is a shared responsibility in the cloud. While the provider does secure its services, everything that the government of Canada deploys to the cloud is our responsibility. And so I often say, it's like you buy the safest, the most secure safe in the world, but if we leave the combination as 000, like that doesn't matter, right? And that's on us. So again, and I go back to the workforce. Our workforce needs to be skilled for these awesome tools. We need to be skilled in such a way that when we use them, we're doing it in such a secure way, and we are protecting citizens' data.
So that's, if I pick up on the talent piece, so it means that we have an opportunity to spend our resources as consumers of the cloud on the people who are working on our applications, thinking about security from our perspective, and we're renting the talent of those people who are looking after the application layer and the hardware layer and actually the very, very latest in security. So if the Department of National Defense in the States and the UK government, they have figured out ways to ensure that from a regulatory framework and perspective, that data is secure and they're willing to do that. It's a matter of growing the trust that we need to do this. And companies in some ways are also having to put some trust on the line here. They have to put some trust that their competitors, what's your competitive advantage if everybody's using exactly the same application layer? So how does that work out? So that's a different kind of decision, but it's much like a national agenda. Who do we want to be on the same cloud with? Where is that data? Is there some other international
and that goes,
issue?
and I know we're going to segue to this, but that goes to the whole issue of choosing wisely.
Yes.
Because not all providers are created equal. And there are some providers that say publicly that they meet certain international standards, like ISO 27018 and what have you. or that are publicly trying to get the government's business or the business of regulated entities like banks or hospitals, and there are others that don't. So that is really part of the due diligence aspect of choosing wisely and not always choosing the cheapest.
And having some way to disengage.
Correct.
So what are, just riffing off of that, what are the things you look for? Like, what are the little telltale signs when you're going through and evaluating?
Well, I'm the one who's brought in to make the deal, so hopefully I'm brought in earlier rather than later. But it's, I mean, and I was just talking to Scott before we started. God bless, we have, as the government, we have obligations and standards that you have to live up to. So you just can't go off and hire anybody, hopefully. In the private sector, unfortunately, things are sometimes get driven by speed or price or ease of, you know, someone knowing someone in a company. What you really need to do, though, is do your due diligence. Look at the providers. Look at their track record. Who do they currently, who are their clients? What's their reputation in the industry? Have they been the subject of public data breaches, or have they had issues with what they've done in the past? And more to the point, understanding, is it actually the provider who is providing those services, or are they just the top of the heap and they're really relying on a whole chain of subcontractors and sub-processors, and it really turns out it's not even them? And then you get into whole issues of where is the data and who's actually doing things. But you really, the key thing is taking the time to do the work in advance and putting all your specifications as much as possible and requirements into RFPs, RFSs, what have you. And again, though, you have to know what you're looking for and what you want to achieve and what the data is.
I have an actual question for you.
Okay. Feel free to start.
Set off a little alarm bell in my head.
I guess I'm not needed. I'm just.
And by the way, audience people, if you have interrupt us, go to the mic. This is supposed to be dynamic, and we're not just the talking heads.
So if you have a contract so you've done your due diligence, and company X with the big cloud says we're doing all of this, 5-10 years later, they may start hiving off and subcontracting. Can you prevent that up front?
Yes, you can if you put that in your contract.
Thank you.
So that's
a good question.
So one of the things, obviously, that you need to do is, so once you have all this great RFP and you've gone through all your requirements and somebody responds, one of the things you should be asking for is a copy of their standard legal agreement, because some cloud vendors, like cloud is very seductive technology, and some cloud vendors have created standard form cloud agreements that literally allow you to sign up in like 2 seconds online. It's a 3-page document with 10 zillion hyperlinks, and basically they want you to just click I OK. Now, granted, in this, for you that would highly be, it would probably not be acceptable, but I've had big clients who just made a mistake. Someone in the organization clicked something and suddenly bound the organization in a contract that is just absolutely not acceptable from a regulatory or other standard. So these are the sorts of issues that you absolutely need to think about. If you don't want them to use subcontractors, or if you want them to ask your consent before they do that for material parts of the cloud, you need to put that in the agreement.
I think, too, you have to be careful because there's a lot of cloud washing happening today, right? Like every technology vendor is turning their thing into a cloud, and so it's a fun word, right? Like I got a cloud, you know. Like I took the bus today; it was public transit cloud, you know. Like so there's like everyone wants to call their thing cloud, right? And so you really got to sit down and go back to the outcomes and benefits. Like what is it you're trying to achieve? So every time they come to the table, right? And I go back to the public utility model. Like we want certain benefits. So I spoke a bit in the beginning about, you know, the way we traditionally deliver IT, which is we own a lot of the assets, but owning those assets puts a liability on us because we have to constantly maintain them, keep them up to date, keep them compliant, as well as it causes very long lead times, right? When a requirement is identified, we have to engineer those solutions together, and we usually do it on a one-by-one basis. With cloud, it's a very utility type model, right? You are getting a slice of a service that already exists, much like you get cable or you get hydro utility. If you went to your hydro provider and said, I only want energy that comes from green energy sources, he's going to say, no, you get the same electrons as everyone else. And the cloud provider acts that way as well. And we get benefits from that, really, because it means we're not going alone, and we're consuming a service that exists, that we know is right, and they're constantly investing in it, making it better, right? That's a key differentiator for a lot of cloud providers is innovation. I'm constantly rolling out new stuff for you, and it's not costing you anything except for the consumption fees. So, you know, when you talk down, sit with a vendor, and if they're starting to stray from those benefits and selling you something that's not meeting those benefits, even though they're calling it cloud, it's not cloud. The other thing is, you know, the cloud market is varied. You've got these huge hyperscale, what we call them. They have large global presence, and they're really geared towards enterprises, right? But at the same time, you also have a very large commercial market where if you think about like Trello, a lot of these kind of collaborative tools where you pay nothing, but you become the product because your data is mined, right? But on the enterprise side, that's very different. So the way we approach them in the government Canada is very different as well. Because with one, we get into very large contract negotiations with a lot of specific terms and conditions. And the other one, you're basically, as you said, clicking OK to an agreement as you pull out a credit card, right?
Or
maybe
not.
that's, or not, right. So, and we treat them differently. So, you know, all this to say that buyer beware. I'm not trying to scare anyone. Cloud is good, but you know, you also should read the terms and conditions before you click OK on them. Although I think you advised me not to do that earlier. I had to sign a release for this. And
That's a release.
Yeah,
That's,
okay.
That's different.
So all this to say that, you know, not to scare anyone, but there is a different market. There's a whole varied market out there, and you may want to put your sacred treasures in a portion of that market, and the other one's okay with chatting with friends or sharing some documents that are unclassified, but you probably don't want to do protected B citizen information in, you know, Slido, for example, right? Not to say it's not a great system, but we haven't vetted it to the same degree.
I do also want to interject a note of hope. Because as part of the evolution of cloud is that the contracts in some ways are getting better, and they've had to get better because governments and financial institutions and you know, people who are dealing with very secure or very confidential medical information have basically pushed back and said to very large providers, we can't do deals with your standard paper. Yeah. So. And not to mention the impact of the European data protection laws, which is having a huge ripple effect across the world and is increasingly, that's just starting, as well as there's a new act in California that's coming in come January 1st, the California Consumer Protection Act. That's going to have a huge impact on US contracts because of concerns around Facebooks and such. So the upshot is, if vendors aren't stupid, if they want to do business, which is obviously what they want to do, they've had to evolve even their standard form contracts in some ways to get better.
So it's like a maturation, like as the industry, you know, you always start off with sort of like a Wild West.
Yeah.
And then as, you know, more people on board and it becomes more mainstream, you end up having, you know, the ones who succeed are the ones who can provide, you know, value and be trusted. And
correct.
And so talking a little bit about sort of the legal and ethical issues that we
Sorry,
have.
I didn't mean to cut. You wanted to say something?
Sorry.
I did.
Yeah. Oh, you okay? No, sorry. I didn't want to cut you.
So no, I just want to. I want to explore this a little bit more. When we start talking, you know, as organizations are starting to move to the cloud, what are the types of things that they need to consider from a legal and ethical perspective as, you know, personal information starts moving to the cloud? Like one of the things that we're working on from a TELUS One's perspective, you know, and we're looking at potential cloud solutions as citizens start to engage with us and start, you know, sharing information with us, and we accept them and we authenticate them to understand that they are who they say they are, and then they can apply for their, you know, employment insurance or see some of their tax information, you know. And as this moves more and more into the cloud, you know, what are the things, the legal and ethical things that we need to start, you know, considering, or that departments need to consider?
Yeah, well, the number one concern absolutely is obviously protecting personal information and security. It is everyone's concern when it comes to cloud, rightfully so, right? So this is this is a combination of your lawyers as well as your technology people who understand the architecture and the requirements. They have to be involved in these negotiations and in setting up these clouds, right? Because the devil is in the details in terms of the terms and conditions in these contracts. You know, to Scott's point, sometimes you become the product, right? In the lower end cloud services, nothing is free. Okay, so if you're getting the use of a cloud tool and you're not being charged, you are the product, right? Because
you get what you pay for.
You are getting what you pay for because they're using your data in some capacity in order to, you know, stay in business, right? So when it comes to obviously a much more mature application like we're talking here, you absolutely need to make sure that your cloud provider, you know, signs up for legal responsibility to use all necessary adequate means, physical, technological, administrative, to protect and secure the data. They also have to make sure everyone down the food chain is doing that. The subcontractors, the sub-processors, the different people involved in that. They also have to make sure they're not misusing or reusing the data for secondary purposes, right? So unfortunately, that's where the boring lawyers come in. We're here to help in terms of just making sure that the terms. Remember I talked about all those juicy hyperlinks and all the, you know, all the things that are floating around.
You guys actually read it.
Someone has to read it. I hate to tell you, someone has to read it because, again, you need to understand what you're signing up to. The other thing to keep about, people are concerned about location, right? So maybe not so much in the private sector, but the government tends to want the data to stay in Canada, right? So yes, a lot of cloud providers allow for that, but that costs more money sometimes, and contracts need to be structured around where sometimes the data is located, right? And so there's also issues of access, who's got rights to it, who can do other things with it, and audit rights, because you want to actually keep the honest. You also need to think about, like, again, I don't want to get too technical here because I'll put you to sleep after lunch, but you want them to sort of give what we call legal representations, and which are basically a fancy term for promises about what they're going to do with it, what they're not going to do with it, you know, making sure they're not using technology that infringes other third-party rights. And when things go wrong, you want what you call indemnities, which is protections. Like, in other words, if there is a data breach, you want to make sure that somebody's going to pay for all this. So that's the sort of thing you want to think about in terms of your cloud contracts. These are the hot issues that always end up being negotiated. Who's responsible in case there's infringement? If there's data breaches, what are the details around the security and protections? Last but not least, I want to talk about the one thing no one loves to talk about except lawyers, the exit, right? So it's a honeymoon. Everyone's in love. There's a new cloud procurement, the brightest and shiniest. It's all great and wonderful. Nobody wants to talk about the divorce. Nobody wants to talk about what happens when maybe you don't want to stay with this cloud provider for the next 900 years, right? How are you going to get your data out? Does the contract even say anything about the form of getting the data out, when it's out? Are there gotchas saying that if people, you know, if there was a lag in payment, the vendor holds your data hostage, just as one example, right? What does getting out look like? What's the timeline on that? So, you know, that's the sort of thing no one wants to think about the divorce when the honeymoon is over, but keep in mind, if you're talking about putting, you know, thousands and thousands of gigabytes or what have you of data in a third-party vendor, you have to think about the exit, right? Because it's not going to be seamless and it's not going to be easy. Last but not least, think about who your vendor is, because occasionally they go bankrupt. I was working on a deal recently where halfway through the deal, the vendor announced that they were going bankrupt. Wow. We ended up doing the deal anyway because they reorged, but these things do happen. These are, you know, third-party vendors, and things happen from a financial perspective.
And being able, so how do you pull your data back from something like that?
How do you?
Yeah.
Well, in this case, we didn't have to because they reorged and they were fine. But that's the sort of thing that you need to address at the forefront, right? You just don't rely on that little standard one line, because chances are it's not even going to be in there.
What are your thoughts, Carolyn?
I think this is great advice, especially the exit clause. I'm a big fan for the exit clause. Not that I've been divorced 9 times, but
yeah, exactly.
I do think you have to think about it up front. I did want to just separate out some of the legal considerations from our responsibilities and our ethical considerations. So it's really important that the onus on responsible use of this data is with the client, for Treasury Board or your department or the company, the enterprise that's using it. So the use of using the platform and applying AI because it's there, right? So those machine learning algorithms and the deep learning and all sorts of AI that you might use that data for. If you don't have a proper data set, if it's not big enough, it's not diverse enough, it doesn't represent the population that you think it does, it's old, any number of things around that, and you just apply and then you take the results, that's on you. It's not on the cloud. It's not actually a cloud problem. So our problems around, if you think of the Toronto and the Montreal declarations and the UN declarations of responsible use of AI, and that means on using the data underneath, that actually doesn't go away because it's the cloud. And it doesn't go, it's not a problem of the cloud. It's up to us in our applications to actually think of those standards. And in this sense, Canada's actually quite a leader in the responsible use of data. And I think that that's something we could be proud of, but we have to take that on ourselves.
So let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. I'm curious. So what impact do you think that AI will have on the use of cloud? When we talk about the the Montreal Declaration.
Well, I'll start on that one. I think that if you put things in the cloud, or don't put things in the cloud, but you're doing digital transformation, and you don't actually use some AI, some clear predictive analysis on what you put in the cloud, if you just digitize, so you just take everything and plunk it up in the cloud, and we've got some apps on there and you can get it, everybody can get it, we're no further ahead. The cloud allows us to spend our resources thinking about how we actually transform our business or transform government or transform the way citizens use this collective data in ways that help us with our health, with our Indigenous languages, with Internet of Things, but we have to actually use the applications on the data. So again, it's not really a cloud problem, it's how we think about how we actually solve these problems. The cloud just lets us put our people where we can really use their capacity rather than on the system. Scott, I don't know if you would agree with that.
I think when I think about AI and cloud, I think there's two facets. I think they're complementary technologies. I think because of cloud's humongous scale and allows you to just take in so much data, right? And you think about Internet of Things and all these sensors and collecting data. Now you've got this massive amount of data, and just traditional analytics probably can't parse all that. And so increasingly, I think we're turning to AI for that. At the same time, training AI models, they're hungry for compute. They need large data sets. And so, again, cloud is a cheap source of that. And, a lot of these specialized GPUs, these graphical processing units that data scientists love, they're quite, I'll say, cheap because you can rent them by the minute in the cloud. On the other hand, you're also seeing AI pop up everywhere in the cloud in terms of the services, whether it's things like Office 365 and you have translation, or you have what they call it, like closed captioning around videos and stuff. So that's popping up everywhere. In cloud providers themselves, you're seeing forecasting now around costs, or security defense that's using AI. So, it's popping up everywhere. It's almost, you don't even know there's AI behind it. You just think it's an algorithm, whatever the case might be, but increasingly it's showing up everywhere, I think. I think there is an interesting phenomena, though, because when it comes to cloud providers, they're providing such powerful AI tools. And we're seeing AI being used in the cloud for good things, like combating child exploitation. And we're also seeing, military or, we'll say law enforcement using some of those same AI tools for things that don't necessarily make people so happy, right? And so it's put the cloud provider in an awkward position where, and you're seeing this more, that they feel really awkward, where they have to basically arbitrate who should and shouldn't use their technology. And on one hand, they'd like to take a point of view like any utility provider, and like a hydroelectricity, and say, well, we provide electricity. People use that to save lives, and some people use that for bad things. We wash our hands of it. But at the same time, because there's a lack of regulation in this area, they have to get into the arbitration, because again, it goes back to reputation and trust. So I think no conclusions there, but I think it's an area that's certainly getting quite interesting, and I think we're going to see some movement on.
Yeah, no, I would just comment further. You've raised some very interesting points, because even the employees of some of these companies in the last couple of months have walked out or protested about some of the use that their own company's technology is being used for. So, yes, there have been strikes at various Googles and such like. So, and there is a heck of a lot of angst, and there's lots of, it's every second conference these days. If it's not cloud, it's AI and the ethics of AI, because there is a lot of concern, quite frankly, about bias and how AI is being used, particularly around decision making in the private sector, around employment, and how people are hired or not hired, how medical decisions are being made or not being made. So, this is a very, again, that's the word of the day here, dynamic. There's going to be, I think there'll be more emerging, and there's a lot of talk around whether there needs to be specific legislation in this area. Because in Canada, we don't tend to legislate from a sector perspective. We tend to legislate in broad principles, or whether existing privacy laws, or although are sufficient. Although I should say, we all know that the existing privacy laws are in the process of being reevaluated and need to be changed.
Is anyone doing it well? Like, is there any nation out there that you would say they've
the Europeans? Well, depending on, remember, whose side are you on? If you're a privacy advocate, you're very keen on what's happening in Europe. If you're an enterprise and you're having to change your practices and spend money to deal with some of these requirements, you may not be so keen. So definitely Europe is ahead in the area, at least from the perspective of turning their minds to the impact of AI and that AI is having on people and decision making.
Okay, excellent. We do have a question, so...
Yay.
Hey, my name's
We
Gray.
have a whole bunch up here.
Yep.
And I work at Treasury Board. But so a lot of this is very interesting. A lot of it I feel is like, kind of my boss's problem to some extent. Now, not to say that I don't take responsibility. Like, I'm interested and I want to know. But to bring it to something that's be more practical for me, now I'm not, but imagine I'm a director in a department and we've identified that we need to put a new service online. And my understanding is that the only way to do that now is kind of cloud technology. So how would I do that? Or maybe what do I need to be thinking about and worrying about as we put that service online?
So I guess there's two ways. One that's probably the right way, and one that is wrong but happens all the time. And as you would with any other IT system, we would hope that you engage your CIO shop simply to ensure that this is governed, right? Like, I think there's a certain fear that now, because you can go out and basically buy a data center on a credit card, or a whole analytics or an ERP or whatever else on a credit card, that we're going to have a proliferation of ungoverned systems and data. And so, part of that is we want the community to keep working with their CIOs to ensure that it's governed. The other way that people are doing is, as I said, I'll be honest, right? Like, IT isn't necessarily well adapted for the cloud. We're still getting over that, and it's a little bit like shame on us, but I can also understand it. And so, and business is smart, right? They know these tools are out there. They see their colleagues using them, and they're very attractive because it's low friction IT. And so when they go to IT and IT says, no, we can't do that, like, I don't want to deal with that, business doesn't take no for an answer, and they just pull out a credit card and they just buy cloud, right? And so, shame on IT for not helping business get there, but we do see a lot of that, and that shadow IT is happening more and more. But I think the answer to that is IT needs to react and be ready for that, right? We can't just tell business no, because that answer is not enough. Business is not going to take that. They are going to get their business done in the most efficient way possible.
I would tell you, please do not just go online.
Yes.
The first standard form contract that you see, if you walk away with nothing else over anything I've said today, please don't do that, because that will be the worst standard form conditions you'll ever see, and you can do better, particularly as a government. person.
Can I
Thank
ask
you
Scott
very
a
much.
question? I'd like to follow up on your question. It was a great question, but I have to say my heart stopped at the idea of every little department getting out the credit card. I'm wondering about how we end up, it is a matter of getting major databases, right? So the government of Canada, if it is still the Wild West and everybody can go and get some cloud service, how do we end up with a national database that we can actually use for national decisions?
So,
Like health
I think when you look at something like Shared Services Canada consolidate a lot of the IT together, and we got certain benefits out of that in terms of knowing the full set of assets, right? And so when you look at who's contracting with the hyperscale providers today, it's Shared Services Canada. So all those things that you listed and scared the crap out of everyone, there is a core group at Shared Services, Public Services and Procurement Canada, at the Canadian Cyber Center for Cybersecurity. I got that wrong, but there's a core group and Department of Justice who are sitting across from those hyperscale cloud providers and trying to address those things. As well, TBS has put certain governance controls in place, right? And it's not to say people can't go rogue, but I mean, we hope people are respecting those things, but all is to say that SSC has stood up a cloud brokering function so that they can maintain that centralized visibility over those assets, right? Part of it is, Shared Services Canada may not be in there provisioning your hardware for you anymore, or provisioning compute, but they can see what you're provisioning. And in fact, one of the things they're doing now is implementing across-the-board guardrails. So we take away certain things. One of them is all these cloud providers have what they call a marketplace where you can buy third-party software, right? That effectively now has been shut off because we do have issues with the standard terms and conditions, and we do have issues with security because they don't go under the same vetting as the cloud provider. They're third party. And so now Shared Services Canada individually whitelists those services as they're required. So across the board, we are still trying to keep that enterprise view in place, and enterprise guardrails and enterprise asset management, even though departments have individual autonomy to go out and provision what they need, there's still a centralized function to ensure that we can keep governance over this.
Is there a centralized function around data standards?
There is. That's not my area. I'm on the technology side, but a few cubicles over, there is. I think that's an increasing area that's growing more and more. Yes.
So if we go back to the question, where exactly should it go?
To work with their IT shop the way they always have.
And they'll interact with shared services,
yes.
or whoever.
Yes.
Yeah. So keep your credit card in your pocket.
Yes. In fact, ordering must be done. Those Shared Services Canada contracts, the ordering must be done through the CIO
And
shop.
hopefully internal counsel.
With counsel.
So for people on the webcast, we'll be asking more questions because I think this is I like the engagement. So in Slido, it's #digital2. Tune as the numeric digital2, and we'll take a Slido question and then we'll go in person. So one of our questions is, why is private better than government for building a cloud? Couldn't we build a GC cloud?
We could, and we probably will one day, but I think we have clouds there that are there today, right? So all the major cloud providers have come to Canada, and those are, you have to think about it in this terms, which is, without us spending a single cent, we have top-tier data centers full of services that are ready to go, that have cost citizens nothing until we start using them. And traditionally what happens is we have to invest a lot of capital in IT to get it up and running, and then we have to migrate to that new technology. And we haven't been very good at that. And it means that a lot of that technology that we built up gets underutilized, right? Because our consumption curve isn't what we expected it to be. So there's a certain advantage. Like, part of this is we want to get away from all that asset ownership. Because we have a lot of people, for example, we have something like 20-some thousand instances of Windows 2008 that have to be replaced because Windows 2008 is going out of support. So for 2 or 3 years, we're going to have people plugging away, changing operating systems with no net new business value. Like, no one's analytics are getting better, no one's pay is getting better doing that. And so But then when we're done that, the next version needs to be replaced, and the next version replaced. And so we've taken a lot of our IT workforce, which are extremely powerful people, very capable people, and turned them into asset managers. At a time when citizens are saying, I want better permits online, I want better information online, I want better birth certificates online. And we're focusing a lot of that valuable IT workforce down at the bottom, asset management. Give that to someone else. We have work for those people, and it's about citizen-facing services.
Excellent. Go ahead.
We've talked about how the cloud is not up in the air, but it's a real place. I'm just wondering to what extent you've seen environmental considerations either in cloud negotiations or in the government's procuring of cloud, and to what extent those considerations influence decisions of service providers.
Excellent. Do you want to take that, Carolyn?
Well, I'll just take a stab at it because it is a very good question. And we do have to actually take into account what that actual impact is going to be. There's no question they have to build solar farms, they have to take over waterfalls to generate enough electricity. Forget the heat that comes off this stuff. But how we actually get a reasonable picture of Google Farm or Amazon, because they're all over the place. It's not like there's one that you could go and measure it. So I think it's a great question. We probably need the cloud to figure it out. Right? I don't know, Scott, but we are going to have to deal with that question.
It's an increasingly area of attention, and the industry has responded by publishing some of their metrics around it, because turning IT into a commodity means we treat it like any other commodity, right? So it's become very cheap by the unit, but what happens is then we consume more of those units. If you think about gasoline, every time it goes down in price, we all start buying SUVs, right? And cloud has effectively done that, where it's turned it in very cheap, so we start consuming more and more. And that has a green impact, and they're aware of that. Some providers are quite good. Others know that they're in a shameful spot and are trying to react. Our last round of contracts did not include any requirements around green requirements. At the time, we were pretty far into the negotiating process because the Government of Canada was just coming out with green standards. So to be honest, I'm not sure if we had tested those with industry yet, so we're probably a little bit late. We're on our second round of cloud contracts. I have no doubt there'll be a third and a fourth, et cetera. So I think there is opportunity to integrate those in there, because it's definitely an area of increasing attention.
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, it doesn't typically become an issue in the private sector, but certainly it could be something that you require in your RFPs. I mean, even to the point where if you're talking about when we are getting into exits or when you're sunsetting technology, are you requiring them to smash hard drives, or are you requiring them to recycle them? So, I mean, it definitely is something that more attention should be paid to. And part of the other issue is that traditionally vendors are so secretive about all of these issues. Even getting to visit a data center or visiting these things, it takes effort, and auditing them is very difficult sometimes. Again, it's up to the clients to put those in the requirements.
So it's an interesting point, actually, because we talk a lot about transparency of data and the use particularly of governments and companies. What's the transparency of how that was used? What's the transparency of how an algorithm came to some conclusion? So what's the transparency around the climate effect? Right? And it's part of the conversation that we tend to leave until some 13-year-old says, hey, so maybe we could be ahead of the curve on this one.
Not that you're 13.
And maybe what you forget is you've got market cloud.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And I mean, that's what happened in the UK. That's what happens in the US. We have market cloud if we choose to use it, right?
Excellent. So again, for the people on the webcast, if you want to ask a question through Slido, it's #digital2. And if you don't want to necessarily ask a question, but you have you like the questions that were that have already been asked, you can vote them up in the order, and we'll make sure we'll ask the ones that have been more popular than the others. So we'll go back to the Slido. So how can we influence requirements when you're looking at like protected B or et cetera, that hinder the full benefits that the cloud can offer? For example, a Treasury Board submission, collaboration.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
I get to duck that.
I'm probably not going to answer your question, but I can understand why people are maybe not happy with where we are. The adoption of cloud, and I'm going to say a lot of the work we've done around security, with privacy, with policy, et cetera, has been a navigation of risk assessment. And we've tried to be very transparent. You know, we've looked at data residency, looked at data sovereignty, we've looked at security, et cetera, and we've tried to be very transparent and take those risk analyses and publish them online as much as possible, because we get media attention. How can department, and so doing that, we've ended up in a spot where we've shut certain things off. And departments are saying bad, you know. So doing it centrally, and I'm going to say it's a double-edged sword. You know, policy is a double-edged sword, whereas on one side, we've set a certain risk assessment and a certain bar, which for individual departments may have been hard for them to assess themselves and might seem overwhelming. The other edge of the sword is some departments are ready to take more risk and are saying, you know what, Treasury Board is too conservative, and SSC and all our partners are too conservative, and if you had given me those decisions, I would get more benefits from cloud. That's valid. I mean, you can beat me with a stick around certain decisions, and we're going to keep moving on that over time. I think we are where we are. I apologize for those who can maybe better take risks and get more business benefits out. You know, I'm sorry we took away that decision from you. On the other hand, I think we could only get to where we are if we had taken away some of those decisions from departments.
And I think it's also, you know, I mean, this is a new space, and we're pioneers in this space, right? And so I think for us, you know, if you take that sort of crawl, walk, run model, as a government, we're always going to be a little bit more risk averse, and I think, you know, we can't be faulted for that.
As you should be.
Right?
Wearing my citizen hat rather than my...
Exactly, and then as you become more comfortable, then you can, you know, you have a little bit more knowledge, and then you can open that up a little bit. So we have a question in the back here.
Hi, I work with National Defense as a program analyst with a pay system. So we do the pay for the military. We are preferred to Phoenix. Anyway, so as part of our services, we are trying to extend, to create a web mobile app, like a mobile app for the cell phones, iOS as well as Android. Mm-hmm. And we are using the D&D cloud-based solution that was procured about a year ago now. The challenge is to have them take out the data into the cloud, even if it's D&D, but it's still Azure. So that's where the challenge is, and we don't know what to do next. Otherwise, everything is ready. We just want to deploy to the cloud, to the production cloud. But for sure, this is all protected A data. There's no protected B at all.
And so where's the challenge in getting that across?
So basically, it's security hurdles.
Yeah. So I'm going to sum up. You know, I get flavors of this kind of question, which is, I'm going to say, we bought the cloud's there, you've told people how to use the cloud, et cetera, but you go back into your own department and you just can't get something cloud-based off the ground. I hear that a lot, and I go back to, again, skills. And I think earlier we were talking about legacy technology, but legacy skills and legacy culture are today, to me, the largest detriment or the largest barrier to scaling our usage of cloud. And, you know, we spent a lot of time around looking at the providers, testing their security, privacy, procurement, legal issues, et cetera, and now probably still the last mile in this is our workforce. And I keep talking about workforce because we keep bringing in legacy methodologies and legacy understanding of technology into the cloud, and it's hurting us. And that's really what's, I think, to me, the focus now is getting people experienced getting people to touch it, remove the mythology around it, actually go in and use some cloud services and stuff. So I think I don't have a great answer for you, but I'm seeing this again and again, questions like yours, where you've told me how to do this, I go back to my department and it's just not happening and it's taking a long time, and we're changing a culture. We're changing a culture.
And I think, in addition to that, it's on all of you to help change that culture. And I know oftentimes people will look to TBS and be like, okay, we're sitting back, TBS, you fix this. But, just for the record, we're a really small organization.
Plus, we haven't fixed anything, I don't think, for anyone.
I don't think our track record is that great when it comes to fixing things. But you guys are the pioneers. You guys are the champions. You're the ones that go back to your department and be that change agent, rattle the cages and be that one. We will always support you, always, from a TBS perspective, but be the one to start pushing that envelope and start making that change, and be that change agent within your department, right? Like that's your role. That should be everybody's role, is to help shift that culture. Yes.
So if I could add a point here, I think that we need to also move away from one size fits all.
Yes.
So there are security requirements for protected information. Most of us are not working there. If you think of the scientists in particular, they're just trying to do science, and you put it on the cloud or don't put it on the cloud, you have to really balance the security and the risk to the hardware and the software and the privacy issues with what is it that they're doing. And so you may have some things that are completely air-gapped, nothing coming in, nothing going out. Some things that are more fluid, particularly around client services. You've got some problems, but everything's not a cabinet secret. So that we actually have different ways of putting the risk and the management at a more principled level, so that we can get some of these things off the ground and going.
Excellent.
And there are, for example, and this is a common misperception, even in the private sector, not all data has to stay in Canada, right? So, there are some data that does for legal reasons or what have you. It doesn't all have to. So there are rules around that, and there's ways to mitigate that. And and the larger vendors are opening Canadian data centers anyway to address those concerns. But so to your point about, not everything has to be treated equally or should be treated equally. And those are the conversations that need to be. There's a lot of misunderstanding around these areas. A lot of sort of people think or people hear, but they don't really investigate. They don't understand the reason behind decisions, right?
Excellent. So we'll do 1, 2, and then go to the Slido.
Hi, my name's Harry from Natural Resources, and we've been facing a lot of issues with getting people excited about actually getting our data ready for cloud. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for cloud and to get our data into cloud, but there's not a lot of enthusiasm about actually getting our data ready for actual AI analytics.
I'm sure no one else here can relate.
And so I was wondering if you had any suggestions for dealing with that and actually drumming up the support to
a data pizza party?
Get the back.
Clean your data. We'll Mary Kondo the data. So I don't know, how do you guys manage it from your perspective?
I wouldn't say that we're managing it holistically by a long shot. It's kind of the keeners do it, right? But the difficulty is if every keener does it, what have you got at the end? You've got a shotgun approach as opposed to something where you can really apply some algorithms. So I think it's kind of actually educating the boss's boss's boss so that they see the value in the use of resources and time to make that happen. And as a collective, and then you get the pizza.
Then you get the pizza. So one of the things that was interesting, I've been working a lot with Estonia and what they've done, and as some of you may know, they're like the leading digital nation in the world. And one of the things we're always really concerned about our data and the cleanliness of our data, and getting it all in order. And they said, no, don't bother. Expose the data. That'll clean it. And, of course, I, have a small heart attack, but there's a truth in there that once you start exposing it and putting it out there, the people who are consuming it and using it, they'll be like, oh, hold on, this doesn't align with this. And then they bring that back, and then it actually gets cleaned while you're using it, right? So that's just something that
But just on the Estonia story, they actually have an individual identifier for every citizen, all 1.3 million or whatever it is. So they actually have a way of standardizing that data.
They
that
do, but
doesn't
they
happen
still,
in almost any other country. But they
true, but it's not perfect, and
No, no.
it's far
No,
from
no.
being clean. And so that was one of the things that they had suggested. But rather than waiting for it to be clean before you put it out there, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sam from Digital Academy, and I was wondering personally how seriously you take the data residency requirements if, just given the nature of the internet, it would traverse other countries.
That's a good question.
Okay, love that question. I love residency questions. So here's my personal point of view, having spent a lot of time. I'm the guy who wrote the residency requirement, and we had a lot of security people and a lot of lawyers and a lot of privacy people look at the question of residency. And at the same time, you have, I'll say, a large industry that's lobbying against residency, who say, with proper protection, proper encryption, et cetera, you can protect it. Being, within your borders is not going to make it more secure. At the same time, does it mean that our laws are now applied to those assets and foreign laws doesn't? All I can say is volumes and volumes have been produced on this with no definitive conclusion, in my opinion. You ask a yes or no question to a lawyer, no offense, and you get like a 10-page write-up on it. And we've tried to summarize those on white papers that we've posted, et cetera. The point, though, is it's not an easy question to answer. And then so where we have to turn is, how do Canadians view that? How would a Canadian view the decision to put tax data in the US or in India? How would a Canadian view the decision to put social insurance information in the US or somewhere else in Ireland or whatever, right? And I think, to me, that's the biggest driver, is the reputational issue, is the government of Canada has to maintain a good reputation with its citizens. And I'm going to say that, to me, is the largest driver behind residency. And I think most people would be kind of shocked around that, saying, no, it's security, it's legal, it's privacy and stuff. And not to dismiss those pillars, but in the end, I'd say the biggest driver is, how would the government look putting certain data sets outside of Canada? And that's, I'd say, the primary driver behind residency.
Mm-hmm. I would actually second that. I act for some governments, and it's optics. Yeah. I mean, you have to look to see if there's actually a legal requirement relating to that particular piece of data, and in some cases there are. But in some cases, it's concern about reputation and optics.
Yep. And that's what's different between us and private industry, whereas they'll make decisions basically on, win or loss of financials. And it's not to say cost isn't important or unimportant to us, but reputation is the thing we hold dearest.
Actually, I would disagree with that, right? Because they have the actual same concern as the government, very much so with respect to reputation, and they're also concerned very much about residency as well.
Okay, and trust as well.
And trust as well, absolutely.
Okay, we have one. Oh, sorry, Carolyn.
No, I was going to say I would give a third to this, but I think, nonetheless, we have to be really, really concerned about the encryption of the data, because often it'll go to some node someplace. Sure. It's not as though it stops right in the 49th, right? And I think that as Canadians and as civil servants, which I think most people here are, we have to be participants in the international setting of standards around how data is treated. If we don't, every other country in the world is sitting at those tables. We need to be participants, and we need to be engaged in setting, or the new hardware will be developed not in
excellent
model.
So we've actually, our time is up. I will take that last question as I had promised. So is there a website which lists successful cloud projects in government? I don't think we have.
No, we've been really bad at tooting our own horn, because we're always worried about the next problem, not the last success. Like, how many people here know that Treasury Board as a department has migrated 80% of its application portfolio to public cloud? Fantastic, thank you. So, but not many people do, and there's a lot of successes in science. I see a lot happening on Twitter, LinkedIn, a lot of people who are in the cloud, use the cloud to communicate, but I'm also gonna look over, I have Emily Salinas who works for me, and she's actually working on an initiative to clean up our web presence, our collaborative presence to build a better FAQ. This is an area that keeps shifting, and I think maybe that's something we should do is put some success cases in.
So there, you've been actioned. You've been tasked. Okay. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Carolyn, Scott, Lisa. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'd like to also thank the people attending. Yeah, go ahead. Round of applause. I think they did a great job.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank the people who attended in person and also the people who are through the webcast. Before we let you go, we have a quick video that we're going to show you. And then there are a couple of things I just need to read out. So you're going to have 15 minutes before your next planned panel, which will be located in Victoria Hall, just up one floor and to the end of the hall. And if you have some time, please go and check out the kiosks in the library room located one floor above us near the elevators. And we're also going to ask you to complete a reflection survey, which you can download on your mobile phones by scanning the QR code on the screen, or located on some of the walls or columns around the room. It's a fast and easy way for us to get your feedback. So let us know how we did on this session and on any of the other sessions. And the school has more events to offer, and I encourage you to visit their website to find out, to register, and to find out what other learning opportunities exist. So once again, thank you guys very much.
We're going to give this away to somebody.
And okay. Do we? I will let you do the honors.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, absolutely.
I was asked to bring a copy of this. So the only question is, what's the fair way to give it away?
I just say throw it. No.
It's not a wedding.
You turn around and you throw it behind you. Maybe we can. Do you want to? Would anybody be interested in a copy of Lisa's book? Yes. A few people. Okay. Why don't we do this after?
Yeah. Why don't you just maybe leave cards or something, and we'll just pick one.
Perfect. We'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you guys very much.
Sit over here so I can see the
video.
video.
So you can watch the video. Excellent.
Innovation is a journey. It's about a culture and a mindset. And in public sector, it's about challenging the status quo and trying to see how do we do things differently, and then how do we learn from it. It's really about empowering executives in public sector to create enabling environments where innovation can thrive. So people can take risks, they can learn from it, and they can share their learning so that they can do things differently and tell that story.
When people think of innovation, often what people think of is sort of hard systems, technology, computer apps. But what we tend to forget is that innovation can also involve soft systems or social systems. So that could involve, for example, the rules and regulations that relate to how we run our public service processes. Disruption is not necessarily something that needs to be feared if you understand it, that it's just basically a change in doing things.
If you're in an innovative environment, you should expect to be doing different things day after day. It takes a lot of creativity, so I don't know that I or anyone else has a complete vision for what the future looks like, but for sure we need to try new things, and that means succeeding and it means failing, and it is an exciting time, and what it means to me is that basically the government is a dynamic place where we're trying to learn and grow. Disruption is important. You can't innovate, you can't move forward, you can't learn unless you disrupt the old practices. We don't want disruption for disruption's sake. What we want is positive change. We want positive disruption.
I think the word disruptive is a bit of a misnomer because it indicates that someone's bothering someone. And we may have to realign resources to these new approaches and technologies. If people are very settled in their ways, this is where the word disruption comes, that they need a bit of a shock, something which is completely different, that changes the way they do things.
Innovation often starts with looking at ourselves and how we can use that understanding to transform the systems that we're in. I like to think of innovation as change with a modern twist.